So now we're going to the most important phase of today's occasion. It's a launch of a book. And launching a book requires a lot of sleepless nights, sacrifices, of course, times you have to cry for not being able to accomplish certain things. And this book we see here today, Whispers from a Wounded Land, the voice of Mother Africa, is the voice of Africa speaking. It is Africa speaking to us in different areas. Yesterday, before I went home, I had to secure at least a copy to go through the book. And I think the first piece itself, before the reviewer will do that part for us, I just want you to look at the title. And there are a few lines I want us to remember before we start this book review. So it is the unfortunate mother. I mean, I read this part and I have to reread it. I have to read again. And at some point, I asked myself, am I really in Africa? If this is actually unfortunate mother, what could I do at some point to at least salvage it from where it is today? And where she just said, strong enough to lead, but her right seized. Her head boils with wisdom, yet she refuses to express it. She possesses worldly riches, yet begs on a daily basis. The last line, yet begs on a daily basis. I go back and remember how many times we have been looking for grants and loans from other countries. A lot of us are indebted to other countries out there. And then I think Harry has done a great work to speak for us. So ladies and gentlemen, it is in this that I'm going to invite on stage the reviewer of this book. But before that, Harry comes from a home. She was raised, brought up in the most disciplined way, taught virtues and morals that teaches her to be who she is today. And it is going to be unfair if I fail to inform you that amongst us is that darling, daring, beloved, charismatic, and cheerful mother of Harry, Ya Kumbajawa, is also in our presence. Please give a round of applause to Ya Kumbajawa. And then, just while we acknowledge her presence, let's invite on the podium the man of literature, if that is the correct word. Literature or literature? Okay. Listen, should I say literature or literature? Or whatever I say. Okay. Let me invite the man of literature. Is that a correct one? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome on stage Mr. Abdoulie Senghore, an English language lecturer at the UTG. Round of applause, please.
Good evening, everybody. Members of the High Table, Honorable Sidia, good evening, Honorable Sir. Authors, poetess, good evening. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, members of the press. My first question is, who dare says anything after listening to that great lecture by the Honorable Sidia Jata? Who dares have anything to add onto that? All what we can do is to crave his permission to do this inglorious task assigned to us by the poetess, else she reports us to the ancestors, and we wouldn't want that. To start with, poetry uses very intense language, uses a lot of literary devices and literary techniques. So to start my review, I want to ground myself into some of the definitions given by the early writers of the genre, starting with the famous romantic writer, William Wordsworth. Is a founder of Romanticism, and he defined poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. In simple terms, poems are emotional and physical experiences that are remembered during your moments of calmness. Matthew Arnold decides to even simplify it for us more. He says we should understand the word of poetry as it is poetry that shows us a mirror of life. Ordinary mirrors reflect reality and not distorted reality. So poetry does not deceive, but it simply depicts the realities of life. Today, as we witness the launch of yet another work of poetry, we are confidently asserting that literary creativity is not a proprietary domain of one group of people. It is not only for academics. It is not only for professors. It is not only for the old. It's a domain for everybody, where everybody has a role to play. Um, it's a field where both the old and the young, academics and non-academics, can add, can contribute through perception, through imagination, and through creativity. Hariba has added her name to this growing number of Gambian writers and poets who continue to raise the flag of Gambian literature in literary creativity. Her debut anthology, Whispers from a Wounded Land, the voice of Mother Africa, is an extra contribution nudging Gambian literature in a positive direction. And I would say it's a must read for all Gambian youths and all poetry enthusiasts. With this debut anthology, she has achieved what Achebe describes as re-education and regeneration of society. And it has given weight to the old saying that until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. We have to start telling our own stories, write our own stories through our poems, through our plays, through our works of prose. We should not leave anyone else to do that for us. Otherwise, we would always be left in the footnotes. Starting with the title of the poem, of the anthology rather, Whispers from a Wounded Land, the voice of motherhood. What is the source of this wound? Because the land is wounded. So what is the source of this wound? And by way of answer, we are saying there are a series, a plethora of historical events that are responsible for this wound. Events that are historical in the distant past, events in the recent past, and events of today that are cause of this wound. They are not just one isolated event, but events that cuts across time. From the time of slavery, the Atlantic slave trade, which was part of the triangular trade, and which was the most lucrative business of that trade, this one started to grow and fester. Up to the time of the Berlin Conference of 1884, where Africa was partitioned, this one continues to fester. That conference, the slave trade, scourged, oppressed, and exploited the people of this continent. It dehumanized our people, not in the interest of our people themselves, but in the interest of those foreign lands. That's what has caused the wound to fester. But then after colonialism came independence. And with some hope of healing of this wound, that's what independence ushered in. But instead, what happened after independence? Perpetual misrule, abuse on the continent made this wound even to fester more. This festering wound, referred to in the title of the work, caused so much pain and suffering to the land and its people. And that silence with this wound is no longer an option. And the whispers from the wounded land must be heard. The words of this wounded land must be heard. And it is the poets, the novelists, and the storytellers who must amplify those whispers. And Harry has done just that in her anthology, Whispers from a Wounded Land. She has amplified the voice of those whispers from Africa. There are 86 poems in the anthology. It weaves through using various speakers, personas, between the distant past, the recent history, the present, and the future of Africa. Out of these 86, we are not going to analyze each and every one of them, otherwise we'll be here till tomorrow probably. So what have we done? We have selected a few of these poems as points of anchor for the purpose of this review. And we are starting with one of the poems, When We Were Caged. When we were caged. This is so because when we were caged, reading that poem leads me to two different interpretations, all of which are evidenced in the poem itself. The two different interpretations refer to different time factors. The time of slavery, which was almost about 300 years ago, and a time just about 7-8 years ago. Very different time factors. That's the first simplistic interpretation is reference to the days of slavery. It gives that vivid visual imagery of our forefathers being put in cages and shipped across the ocean to a foreign land where they are denied all forms of freedom. And that lasted for nearly 300 years. Then came emancipation. But then in the other sense, when we were caged, depicts the Gambia's recent history of 22 years of dictatorship. The imageries of lack of freedom of expression and as lack of freedom of association, and the ruthlessness with which the dictators dealt with dissent are highly visualized in that poem. The regime used various means to silence everybody and was successful in thwarting all attempts at gaining freedom for the people of this country. Using the third-person perspective, in the first poem of the narrative, the unfortunate mother, that's not the first poem, but it's one of the poems. Yeah, it's the first poem in the anthology, the unfortunate mother. Here, mother may simply be seen as a woman who has a child, but it's a metaphor for the continent of Africa itself. It is more than a woman, right? And what the speaker has done here, extolling this power, the strength, the wisdom, the riches of Mother Africa. All these things are ascribed to the continent. There is wisdom in the continent. There is power in the continent. There are resources in this continent. But this continent, Africa, it seems to be reluctant, seems to refuse to harness that wisdom, to harness those resources and make life better for its people. Remember, the continent is an abstract thing. It's the the continent who should use that wisdom, who should use those resources for the betterment of the populations on the continent. According to the speaker, this is as a result of Mother Africa's failure to utilize the intellect. And that is clearly seen in the second stanza of that poem, which I really want to read because I fell in love with that stanza. Her voice can control nations from this to many generations with no cunning interruptions, but chooses to stoop so low. Not because of her humility, nor is it her love for humanity, but because she sold her mind to slavery, which dilutes her beauty and bravery. This is what the people of Africa have done to the African continent, thereby perpetuating this vicious cycle of poverty, vicious cycle of suffering. And the persona, the speaker in that poem, ends by advocating for the place of her children to be heard. In other words, assigning this generation and the next a task not to follow in the footsteps of their forebears, to make things better, to make life better for the people on this continent. This litany of lamentation continues into another poem, Mother Africa. The poem itself, an apostrophe, there is a speaker addressing a continent which is not a living thing. He uses a series of rhetorical exclamations, a couple of rhetorical questions, and raises concern for the future of her children, the future of the people of Africa. He goes on to further remind Africa of the words of another renowned poet, Kofi Awunu. In one of his poems, Awunu says, "Sue the old days, wear them under new garments." What is this speaker telling us by quoting from another poet? Africa cannot afford to remain a captive of the past. Like when we listen to so much discourse, we hear a lot of blame on colonialism, a lot of blame on slavery, a lot of blame on neocolonialism. Must we continue like that? That is the question. We must not remain captive to that past. Africa must chart a novel way forward for the good of our people. The speaker tells us that we cannot keep doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. If we continue doing the same thing the same way, the result will obviously be the same. We have to change ways of how we do things. Entrusting our affairs to thieves, to crooks, to corrupt people is not the way forward. Africa must listen to the voices of conscience to change the narrative. But what is this voice of conscience? Elaborating on the way forward in another poem, If Africa, this voice of conscience calls for investment in the human resource base of the continent, developing the human resource, combating greed and nepotism, empowering youths and giving them responsibility. This, according to the speaker, will reverse this vicious cycle of pain and suffering. Intertwining this vision of a hopeful future with the dawn of independence. We're saying the dawn of independence because there was so much hope when independence was on the horizon, just like we have so much hope today. But why is it only hope? There is a reference that I'm making from the poem many years ago and 18th February. These are both poems in the anthology. In the poem many years ago, the speaker celebrates the brave men who fought against colonialism and ushered in self-rule. He started with the great nationalist, Edward Francis Small, often labeled as the father of Gambian nationalism, to the time of independence through the leadership of Sir Dawda Kairaba Jawara, the first president of the republic. There was so much hope. But then, in both poems, many years ago, and 18 February, we see the colonial master being demonized, and that's expression of joy and happiness that came with independence. Unfortunately, though, the hope that inspired the fight for independence through those nationalist leaders has almost become an illusion due to Africa's inability to harness its resources for her people. For this failure of Africa, the poet or poetess puts the blame on what she calls the African Homo sapien. Homo sapien, intelligent human beings, right? So the African Homo sapien, in my own interpretation, is the African intellectual. And our speaker here is blaming these people for the failure of Africa. The persona ironically refers to them as gifted with wisdom. Ironically, in the sense that why is that gift not utilized. They perceive themselves as champions. If they are champions, why have they failed to lead this country out of this darkness? Putting forward very convincing argument. If their arguments are very convincing, why are we still where we are? He refers to them as able to cram theories and regurgitate them, able to cram narratives and regurgitate them. What is the essence of those intelligence that enable them to cram those theories and narratives if they cannot rescue this continent of ours out of the doldrums? Yet, in the concluding lines of that poem, the poet or the speaker calls for an overall, a total system change, a transformation that would lead Africa out of this darkness to a better thing for its people. At this stage, I refer to the poet as being eclectic, in the sense that from one salient topic to another, her poems create a connection between different issues affecting the African continent, captivating the reader across various topics directly related to her society. In the African woman, she celebrates motherhood as a woman and salutes mothers as the canopy of protection. She salutes mothers as being an umbrella of love, as being gracious, and being always available to give support to their children. And in the poem, If I Die and Death, she crosses the realms of the living and he joins the realms of the metaphysical poets. In both poems, the purpose of life, the purpose of our mortality on this earth are depicted, and attention is also given to the afterlife and how one must prepare for that afterlife. This is very apt as a religious society. In the poems I Don't Know, and in the poem Poetry, and in the poem The Beauty of Nature, the poetess follows in the footsteps of the romantic writers. She extols the beauty of love. She extols the beauty of nature. And in both poems, establishes a relationship between both love and nature that we cannot ignore if we are to live happy lives on this planet. As we draw to a conclusion in this review, we are saying that from the first to the last poem in the anthology, the themes and style flow with a rhythm akin to the drumbeat that characterizes African culture. So she did not ignore culture in her writings, with a voice that speaks from the depths of the continent's soul. And the language in some of these poems is domesticated language. In other words, you will find in some of these poems words borrowed from the local language. In other words, writing in English, but indigenizing it by infusing it with words from the local language, giving it a local tinge and a flavor, and thereby giving it even more contextual value. Going back to what Chinua Achebe said about writers, he says that it is the responsibility of writers to help society regain belief in itself and put away the complexes of the years of denegation, and self-abasement. So writers have a very important role in making society believe in themselves, believe in their ability to take charge of their own future and chart a different future forward. This statement expostulates the paramount importance authors and their works play in the process of enlightening people and awakening their self-consciousness for a much needed and thorough decolonization process. Achebe further states in the same essay that the writer, so if you are a writer here today, you cannot be excused from the task of a re-education and a regeneration that must be done. We must re-educate our people. We must regenerate the idea of self-confidence. We must do away with that mindset that believes that it's only out of the continent that we can succeed. That's a mindset we have to go do away with. So we say bravo to authors like Harry, poetess, and we say she is following in the footsteps of the founding fathers of African poetry. And she has given us poetry enthusiasts a worthy anthology that we need to read, an anthology that deserves to be on any shelf in any of our libraries, whether it's a home library, whether it's a school library or a community library. This anthology needs to be on the shelves of those libraries. On a final note, I use one of Harry's poems to give Harry herself a message. The poem she entitles My Only Crime, where the issue of laziness deters those with a message to pass from writing. Laziness should not stop you from writing. If you have a message that can benefit society, write it. So I am telling Harry, whether it's a word or a phrase that you write, whether it's a sentence or a line that you write, whether it's a paragraph or a stanza that you write, you must keep writing, because every one of them is progress. Whenever you write, you have left something for generations to read. So keep writing. Thank you all for your kind attention.